That call came through like the tide, steady, reliable, something I could set my watch by. Last Sunday, it didn't come. I told myself he was busy. A late shift at the workshop, maybe. Traffic on the motorway. His phone had gone flat before. I sat in my armchair by the window and watched the light drain out of the Waikato sky. And I told myself there was nothing to worry about. By 9 o'clock, I'd rung him 6 times. I'm grateful you're here with me right now. Before we go any further, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And tell me, how old are you? I genuinely want to know who's listening. One small note before we begin. Parts of this story include fictionalized elements for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real names or places is coincidental. But the heart of what happened, the warning signs I ignored, the moment I nearly lost everything that's as real as anything I've ever known. My name is Gerald Tanner. I'm 67 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 35 years building bridges, culverts, and drainage systems across the North Island. I live in a weatherboard house in a quiet street in Hamilton, the kind of place where the neighbor still brings over tomatoes from her garden in summer and waves from her front porch when you back out of the driveway. My son's name is Daniel. He's 38, a diesel mechanic who runs his own workshop in Tauranga, 2.5 hours east along State Highway 1. He married Renata 9 years ago, a sharp-tongued, well-dressed woman who worked in property development. They have a daughter, Lily, who turned 9 last April. Every Sunday at 5:30, Daniel rang. Always from the house phone, because Renata complained about the mobile bill. He'd tell me about whatever engine he'd been pulling apart that week, about Lily's school projects, about the garden he was trying to get established out the back. I'd tell him about my tomatoes, the roof spouting I'd finally got around to clearing, the neighbor's new dog that wouldn't stop barking at my fence. We'd talk for 40 minutes, sometimes an hour. Then he'd hand the phone to Lily, and she'd tell me something she'd learned that week, a fact about dolphins, or the name of a planet, or how photosynthesis worked. Those calls were the rhythm of my week. Last Sunday, the phone sat silent on the bench. 5:30 came. 20 to 6. 6 o'clock. I picked up the receiver, heard the dial tone, put it back down. Nothing wrong with the line. I dialed Daniel's number, the workshop landline first, then his mobile. Both rang out. Then Renata's mobile. Voicemail immediately. Like the phone had been switched off at the wall. I left a message. Told myself he was probably at a barbecue somewhere, out of range. The Coromandel maybe. People lost signal all the time out there. By 8:30, I'd rung 4 more times. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold and thought about Daniel's voice the last few times we'd spoken. He'd been quieter than usual over the past month. When I'd asked if everything was all right, he'd said yes. Just tired, the workshop had been flat out. But there was something underneath it, a tightness, like a bolt done up too hard. 35 years as an engineer teaches you to notice stress in a structure before it fails. A hairline crack in a concrete pour. A bolt that vibrates slightly when everything else is still. Small signals that something is carrying more load than it was built to hold. That's what Daniel's voice had been. A structure under too much load. I rang his neighbor, a bloke named Roy, who lived 2 doors down and sometimes watched the place when the family was away. 7 rings before he answered, and I could hear the television in the background. Haven't seen them since Thursday, Gez, he said. Car's been gone. I figured they'd gone up the mount for the weekend or something. Thursday. That was 3 days ago. I told myself they'd gone away. People did that. Spontaneous long weekends, school holidays coming up. There was a perfectly ordinary explanation. But I lay awake until 2 in the morning listening to the rain on the roof. And I already knew. Monday morning I rang Daniel's workshop at 7:30. One of his employees answered, a young bloke named Wiremu, who'd worked there since the place opened. "Oh, Mr. Tanner. Hi." His voice shifted in a way I didn't like. "Yeah, Daniel hasn't been in since Wednesday. Said he wasn't feeling well. We've just been getting on with it." Wednesday. He'd been absent since Wednesday. In 12 years of running that workshop, Daniel had missed 3 days total. Once when he had a kidney stone. Once when Lily was in hospital with croup. Once when his car was rear-ended on the way to work. I rang Roy again. Then I rang Daniel's mobile again. Then I sat in my kitchen and made myself think. Renata. I'd never entirely trusted her. I'd tried. Lord knows I'd tried. Because Daniel loved her, and that was enough reason. But from the beginning, there had been something about her, the way she talked about money. Always in terms of what things were worth, what opportunities were being wasted, what other people had that she didn't. The way she looked at Daniel sometimes. Not with affection, but with a kind of calculation. I'd mentioned it once, carefully. About 3 years into the marriage, Daniel had looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Dad, I love her. Give her a chance." And I had. I'd swallowed my doubts and smiled at Christmas and shaken her father's hand at the birthday parties and told myself I was a suspicious old man who needed to mind his own business. Now, sitting at my kitchen bench with the rain still coming down, I thought about the last conversation I'd had with Renata about 6 weeks ago, when she'd rung to tell me Daniel had twisted his ankle playing touch rugby and wouldn't be driving for a few days. She'd been oddly cheerful about it. Brisk and bright in a way that hadn't quite matched the message. There'd been something else, too. About a month ago, Lily had spent a week with me during the school term, unusual, because Renata preferred to keep close control of Lily's schedule. On the third night, while we were watching telly after dinner, Lily had said quietly, without looking at me, "Granddad, do you think my dad is okay?" I'd looked at her then. She was picking at the edge of her sleeve, eyes fixed on the screen. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" She'd shrugged. "He looks tired, and Mum and him argue a lot at night, when they think I can't hear." I should have asked more. I should have pressed her gently, found out what she'd heard, but I'd said the wrong thing. I'd said I was sure everything was fine because I didn't want to frighten her. Because I told myself it was probably just the normal friction of a busy household. At 9 Monday morning, I threw an overnight bag together. Spare clothes, my medications, the spare key Daniel had given me 5 years ago. He'd pressed it into my hand one evening after I'd driven up to help him fix the hot water cylinder. "Just keep it, Dad. For emergencies." This felt like an emergency. I tried his number one more time before I left. Straight to voicemail. "It's your father," I said. "I'm driving up this morning. Ring me the moment you get this. Please." I was on the motorway by 9:30. Coffee in the cup holder. The Waikato River flashing silver through the trees on my left. I'd made this drive hundreds of times, school prize givings, Lily's birthday parties, long weekends when I just wanted to see them. I knew every passing lane, every rest stop, the petrol station at the Tauranga turnoff where the pies were always hot. But that morning the drive felt different. The distance felt wrong. Too long, and not long enough at the same time. I thought about bridges. When you build a bridge, you design for the worst-case load, the heaviest truck, the strongest flood, the wind at its most punishing. The structure has to hold even when everything is at its worst. But what happens when the load isn't a flood or a truck? What happens when the pressure comes from inside, from something corroding quietly at the foundations while everything on the surface still looks fine? I thought about the way Daniel's voice had sounded over the last few months. I thought about Lily asking if her father was okay. I turned off the highway at the Tauranga interchange just before noon and drove through the familiar streets toward the suburb where Daniel's house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac backing onto a reserve. A nice house, a brick and tile, 4 bedrooms, established garden, more house than a mechanic's salary easily covered, which had always made me wonder, but I'd filed that thought away too. His car wasn't in the driveway. The curtains were all drawn. The letterbox was overflowing with the week's worth of mail. A rubbish bin had been left at the curb since collection day and not brought back in. I sat in my car for a long moment, looking at the house. Then I got out and walked up to the front door and knocked. Nothing. I knocked again. Louder. Daniel. It's Dad. A fantail landed on the letterbox and watched me, which felt either like a good sign or a very bad one, depending on what you believed. I walked around the side of the house. The back gate was unlocked. The garden was overgrown. That surprised me, because Daniel had been proud of his garden. Out there, every Saturday morning with his gloves on. The raised beds he'd built last spring were still there, but whatever he'd planted had gone to seed and dry. A child's bicycle lay on its side on the lawn. I tried the back door. Locked. I was standing there, hand on the doorknob, when I heard it. A sound from the garage. Very faint. Not mechanical, no engine running, no tools. Just a rhythmic sound, dull and muffled, like something being struck slowly against wood. My chest went tight. The garage had a side door with a standard padlock, but I'd helped Daniel install the lock 2 years ago, and I knew the hasp was only screwed into weathered timber. I pulled on it hard twice, and on the second pull the screws tore free and the door swung inward. The light was off. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust. Then I saw him. Daniel was sitting on the concrete floor against the far wall, his back against a shelving unit, his knees drawn up to his chest. His wrists were zip-tied to a steel pipe that ran along the base of the shelving. He'd been hitting his foot against the metal leg of a workbench. That was the sound I'd heard. His face was wrong. Swollen around the left eye, dried blood on his lip, skin gray with dehydration. He squinted at the light coming through the door like a man who hadn't seen daylight in days. "Dad," he said. His voice came out cracked and raw. I was across the room before I'd finished thinking. I got down on my knees beside him, and I put my hand on his face and I said, "I've got you, mate. I've got you." He closed his eyes. "Lily," he said. "Where's Lily?" I told him I didn't know yet, but I was going to find out. I told him to stay with me. I pulled out my penknife and cut the zip ties, and his arms dropped and he made a sound that I will never forget for as long as I live. I rang 111 while I was still kneeling on that concrete floor. The ambulance took 22 minutes to arrive. I know, because I watched every second of it. I held a bottle of water to Daniel's lips and I kept talking to him steady, quiet. The way you talk to someone when you're not sure how badly they're hurt and you need them to stay conscious. By the time the paramedics came through that side door, I knew enough to be terrified for Lily. At Tauranga Hospital, they worked on Daniel for 2 hours while I sat in a waiting room that smelled of hand sanitizer and bad coffee and tried to keep myself together. Detective Helen Rawiri, from Bay of Plenty CIB, arrived at 1 o'clock. She was in her early 40s, efficient and calm, and she listened without interrupting while I told her everything. The missed calls, Roy's account, the bruising on Daniel's face, Renata's absence. The timeline she pieced together over the next 48 hours was this. On the Wednesday evening, 5 days before I arrived, there had been a confrontation. Daniel had been restrained in the garage. We'd learn the details later, from Daniel himself. Once he was strong enough to speak, Renata and the man had taken her car and Lily and left. Daniel had survived on a tap that dripped into a bucket near the wall. He'd managed to shift close enough to reach it. He'd been alone in that garage for 5 days. 5 days. He was 38 years old and in reasonable health, which is the only reason he was still alive. When Detective Rawiri told me that Lily hadn't been found yet, I felt something shift in my chest. Not panic. Panic was too loud. This was quieter and heavier than panic. This was the feeling of a structure beginning to fail. "We'll find her," Rawiri said. "We're treating this as a priority missing persons, and we're looking at Renata as the primary person of interest." Daniel was coherent by Tuesday morning. Pale, still shaking. An IV drip in his arm, but coherent. I sat beside his bed and held his hand while he talked. He told me Renata had been seeing someone, a man named Marcus, who turned out to be an old contact from her property development days. He told me things had been bad for 18 months, that the arguments Lily had heard were about money and debt and decisions he hadn't known she was making. He told me she'd used his business as collateral for a loan he hadn't known existed, and when the investment went wrong, she'd panicked. He told me she'd said, before she left with Marcus, that she was taking Lily and starting over somewhere he'd never find them, that if he rang me or the police, she'd make sure the debt collectors knew where to find the workshop. She'd believed, I think, that fear would keep him quiet long enough for her to disappear. She'd underestimated how stubborn a Tanner can be. "She knew you'd come," Daniel said to me at one point, his voice still rough. "She said you would. She said she was counting on me being too scared to make a noise." He'd been too weak to make much of one, but he'd made the one he could, that slow, rhythmic knock against the workbench leg, just in case anyone was close enough to hear. Detective Rawiri worked fast. Within 72 hours, she had a partial picture of where Renata had gone. CCTV from a petrol station north of Auckland put the car on State Highway 1 heading toward Northland on the Thursday. A motel in Wangare had a booking under a name that was 2 letters off from Renata's, close enough to be careless. What broke it open was Renata's sister. Her name was Cora, 29 years old, living in Auckland. She rang the tip line on Wednesday morning, 4 days after I'd found Daniel. Rawiri told me about it afterward. "She was crying," Rawiri said. "She said she'd had a phone call from Renata the night before. Renata was asking her to let them stay. Cora said she told Renata no, said she wasn't going to help her hide a child from her father. Cora had given the police the number Renata had called from, and the number had been traced to a motel in Kaitāia. The arrest happened the following morning. Renata, Marcus, and Lily, in a room at the end of a motel block overlooking Scrub and Manuka. Lily was not physically harmed. That was the first thing Detective Rawiri said when she called me. "Lily is not hurt. She is safe." I had to excuse myself from the room and stand in the hospital corridor for a while before I could say anything back. When I was finally allowed to see Lily at the Family Support Center in Wangare, a plain, quiet room with a couch and a box of tissues and a poster of New Zealand birds on the wall. She walked through the door in her school tracksuit, her hair in a messy plait, and she looked at me with eyes that were far older than 9. And she said, "Did you find Dad?" "I found him," I said. "He's going to be fine." She sat down next to me and leaned against my side and didn't say anything for a long time. I put my arm around her and felt her breathe. After a while, she said, "Mum told me Dad was sick and we had to go away for a while. But I knew something was wrong." "How did you know?" She was quiet. Then she said, "Because Dad always rings you on Sundays." And she didn't let him ring you. A child of 9. And she understood that the missing phone call meant something. The investigation that followed taught me more about my son's marriage than I'd learned in 9 years. What Detective Rawiri put together over the following weeks showed a pattern I recognized in hindsight, small signs I'd seen and told myself were nothing. Renata had borrowed against the business without Daniel's knowledge. Twice. The second loan had been secured, using documentation that Daniel's signature had been forged on. Marcus, whose full name was Marcus Driscoll, had introduced her to the lender, taken a commission, and had been involved in at least 2 other similar arrangements in other regions. Fraud Squad had been looking at him for 14 months. The motive, when it was laid out clearly, was as simple as it was brutal. Renata had needed to disappear. Before the debt came due, she'd needed to buy time, and she'd calculated that leaving Daniel restrained alive in his own garage was less risky than the alternative. She'd thought fear and confusion would slow everything down long enough for her to get far enough away. What she hadn't counted on was that Daniel had a father who rang every Sunday without fail. And when the call didn't come, that father got in his car. Renata and Marcus were both charged. The process took 14 months. I will not say it was smooth or quick or that the legal system made it easy. It was none of those things. There were delays, adjournments, a defense strategy that tried to paint Daniel as controlling and financially dishonest, which was so far from the truth that it would have been laughable if it hadn't been so cruel. Daniel sat through all of it. He hired a lawyer from his own savings, a woman named Sandra Yee, who was methodical and unflappable, and did not once seem rattled by anything the defense threw at her. Lily continued her sessions with a child psychologist throughout. At first, she was withdrawn, sleeping badly, not wanting to be alone. By month 6, she was laughing again, playing with the kids next door, asking questions about things that had nothing to do with any of this. That laughter was the best sound I'd heard in years. In the end, the charges that stuck were this. Renata received a sentence of 6 years for unlawful detention, fraud, and document forgery. Marcus Driscoll received 8 years. Given his prior pattern of financial offending, the judge was direct in sentencing, noting that the impact on a 9-year-old child and a man left restrained in his own garage were not things this court would treat lightly. I was in the gallery when the verdicts came through. Daniel was beside me, and I felt him exhale when the judge read the final charge. A long, slow breath, like a man who'd been holding one in for over a year. Outside the courthouse, a journalist tried to ask me how I felt. I didn't answer. I just walked to where Daniel and Lily were waiting by my car, and Lily grabbed my hand, and we went and got fish and chips on the waterfront because that's what she'd asked for. And that was what we did. 6 months after sentencing, I was helping Daniel repair the raised garden beds in his backyard, the same ones that had gone to seed the year before. Lily was sitting on an upturned bucket beside us, handing us screws when we needed them, occasionally asking questions that had nothing to do with construction. "Why do you always use the thick screws for the corners?" she asked. "Because the corners take the most stress," I told her. "Everything puts its weight on the corners eventually. You want them solid." She thought about this. Exactly like how a bridge works. She nodded as if I'd told her something important, and then held out the next screw. Looking back now, I can identify with the clear eyes of hindsight every moment where I saw something that should have made me act sooner. The way Renata talked about money, the tightness in Daniel's voice in those last months, Lily asking me if her father was okay, and me reassuring her instead of asking the next question. I was a civil engineer for 35 years. I built my career on the principle that you test the structure before it fails, not after. You don't wait for the crack to become a collapse. You look for the hairline fracture, the vibration that shouldn't be there, the bolt that's carrying more than it should. I applied that principle every day at work for 3.5 decades, and then I went home and failed to apply it to my own family. That is the thing I have to live with. Not guilt. I've had to work hard to separate guilt from grief, and I think Daniel would tell you the same, but a kind of sober knowledge, an understanding that the instincts we develop in our working lives, the ones that keep structures from falling and bridges from failing, those same instincts apply to the people we love. We just have to trust them. If someone in your life goes quiet in a particular way, not tired quiet, but careful quiet, the way people go quiet when they're managing something they can't talk about, trust that feeling. Ask the next question. Don't let politeness or the fear of overstepping stop you from being the person they can call. And if the phone call doesn't come, the one that always comes, the one that's been coming for years without missing a beat, don't wait until morning. Get in the car. Lily still asks questions about bridges. She wants to be an engineer now, which Daniel finds hilarious, and I find perfectly sensible. We spend Sunday afternoons sometimes driving over the older bridges on the back roads, and I tell her about the loads they carry and what holds them together. Last Sunday, at 5:30, my phone rang. It was Daniel. Of course it was. We talked for 45 minutes. He told me about a restored vintage engine he'd been rebuilding. The kind of job he loves. The kind that takes patience and good instincts and a willingness to understand how something works before you take it apart. He told me Lily had won a science award at school. Then Lily took the phone and told me a fact she'd learned that week. Did I know that the Auckland Harbour Bridge uses a type of paint system designed to last 60 years without significant maintenance? I told her I did know that, actually. I told her the paint system was applied in the 1960s, and it still holds. Like it was built to last, she said. Exactly like that, I told her. Exactly like that. If this story reached you and stayed with you, I'd ask you to do one thing this week. Think of someone you love who's gone quieter than usual. Someone whose voice has that particular tightness. Someone you've been meaning to check on. Check on them. Don't wait for the Sunday call that doesn't come. The connection between people who love each other isn't delicate, it's built to carry tremendous weight. But every connection needs maintenance. Every bridge needs checking. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is simply show up. This is Silver Verdict, and thank you for being here with me.